I've decided to put together a collection of random or almost random anecdotes from life in ancient Rome. Some of them I've mentioned in my other videos, some of them I never mentioned at all. These stories are interesting and sometimes amusing in their own right. But the main purpose here is different. These 10 anecdotes might challenge our perception of what ancient Roman society really was, and help us overcome a number of misconceptions that have been forced upon us for centuries, and are still being forced upon us today through movies and other works of fiction. Cato the Elder and his wise squad. Cato the Elder, aka Cato the Censor, was a model of traditional Roman morality, traditional virtue. And it was a very tough and sometimes even cruel virtue. Having gone through the whole cursus honorum, becoming a consul in the end, he later took the position of a censor. You can see the hint in the nickname Cato the Censor. A censor is supposed to oversee, sorry for being obvious, census and statistics, as well as public morality. And the censor could, in theory, expel a senator for immoral behavior. Cato obviously exercised this right more than once, but the case of Senator Manilius is particularly interesting. Yes, under the guise of "I'm defending morals and virtue," quite probably it was mostly just settling scores with political opponents. And that's the first thing we need to understand. But it doesn't change the fact that Cato was indeed a champion of Roman morality. He dismissed Senator Manilius in this manner, and I quote Plutarch. Cato expelled another senator who was thought to have good prospects for the consulship, namely Manilius, because he embraced his wife in open day before the eyes of his daughter. For his own part, he said, he never embraced his wife unless it thundered loudly, and it was a pleasantry of his to remark that he was a happy man when it thundered. Sorry for the redundancy, but once again, Cato expelled a senator for immoral, one might even say licentious, behavior. From the point of view of a Roman hardcore traditionalist, embracing your wife in front of your own child is immoral. But Cato didn't stop at that. He also decided to brag about his own moral superiority in the way where it started to sound like an outright mockery. From this amusing story, we can learn something about politics in ancient Rome, and also what was considered moral and what was not. In some ways, this story is a great source on these famous Roman orgies that Christians and bad writers have been telling us about for centuries. Nero and his wives. Many times we have heard the amazing story of how Nero married a boy who looked like his late wife, Sabina. Nero castrated the boy and then married him. You can hear quite a lot of stories like that about Nero. Suetonius and Cassius Dio are more than willing to share this kind of information. The tiny little nuance here is that pretty much all of it is just BS, plain and simple. Nero couldn't marry a castrated boy. These are just weird tropes of ancient Roman historical literature. And the historical works of that period, as well as of the previous periods, as well as the Greek models from which the Romans borrowed their tradition. Well, historical works were a special type of literature. They still are, in a way. Therefore, some of the facts reported in historical works are not facts, but merely following the rules of the game, the tropes of the genre. You should never underestimate this aspect, and quite a lot of information should be treated with skepticism. At the same time, of course, with all of the shortcomings of Roman historiography, the quality of the material there naturally is just head and shoulders above, for example, of the medieval chronicles. which are frequently just poorly written fantasy books. The very same Suetonius and Cassius Dio are also quite ready to tell you that the above-mentioned Sabina, Nero's wife, whom he loved dearly, but according to unverified rumors, kicked her in the stomach during pregnancy and then she died. Well, the origins of Sabina were so humble that Nero had to make up stories that she was actually descended from some mythical ancient kings or something, so that he could present the case in such a way as if she was in some way as noble as the senatorial class. And this colossal social gap between Nero and his bride is just an illusion, which means they can be formally married and not dismissed immediately. And this interesting story exists in the sources practically like a couple of pages apart from the story about marrying a castrated boy, even though these anecdotes are in absolute contradiction with each other. Cassius Dio and the Pantheon. Here we will continue with the topic of the reliability of ancient Roman historians. I had a video about the Pantheon on the sister channel. Plus, I've discussed a little bit how the work of Cassius Dio, our most important source for the history of the 2nd century, was stitched up from different fragments. The links are in the description naturally. Here's the thing. We cannot normally attribute the Pantheon, one of the greatest ancient Roman structures, like to which god or gods it was dedicated. It is fairly obvious from its appearance and design that it has something to do with the solar cult. But why is it called the Pantheon? Cassius Dio comes to the rescue. Here's what he says. Also he, Agrippa, completed the building called the Pantheon. It has this name, perhaps, because it received among the images which decorated it the statues of many gods, including Mars and Venus. But my own opinion of the name is that because of its vaulted roof, it resembles the heavens. This is interesting information, but this is not the anecdote. The anecdote is that Cassius Dio, as it commonly believed, was a suffect consul under Septimius Severus. And in fact, he lived in Rome for many years. Once again, a man who was passing the Pantheon almost every day for many years, its iteration erected by Hadrian. Well, he cannot say why the temple was nicknamed the Pantheon, and cannot properly attribute this structure, even though he could just, walk inside and ask, I guess. I don't know why so little attention is paid to this tiny curious fact. There could be several explanations, and one of them is this. Cassius Dio never lived in Rome, and he was never a consul. Perhaps he's simply lying about this in his text. Or the information has been redacted. I mean, we know for a fact that the information was redacted. There's no doubt about it at all. The only question is how much, which fragments, and why. Let me remind you that the work of Cassius Dio has not been preserved in its entirety, and it is assembled from various fragments, plus from the epitome excerpts of a certain monk Syphilinus, who just inserted their Christian interpolations, which is no secret to anyone. Some of the explicit interpolations are even marked as such in the footnotes in printed editions of Cassius Dio. Vespasian and Greed. There's a number of reasonably funny anecdotes about Vespasian, presenting him as a hilarious man with an idiosyncratic sense of humor. Quite probably it actually reflects the reality. But let's not forget that we're talking about a person who won the Civil War and was more than capable of eliminating political opponents and critics of his regime. Plus, there's a theory that he directly commanded to portray the Julian, Claudian emperors as evil imbeciles, which we can see now in the surviving historical sources. So we have nice short stories about Vespasian, especially in Suetonius and his 12 Caesars, where occasionally he just shoots anecdotes one by one, like his Diogenes Laertius or something. One of the prominent topics is greed and how stingy Vespasian was. For example, on the report of a deputation that a colossal statue of great cost has been voted him at public expense, he demanded to have it set up at once, and holding out his open hand, said that the base was ready. Yeah, that's a good joke. But I'd like to talk more about this misunderstood story which gave us the famous phrase, money doesn't smell. The origins of this phrase is in the works of Suetonius and Cassius Dio, but the wording is very different. For example, here's the quote from Suetonius. When Titus found fault with him for contriving attacks upon public conveniences, he held a piece of money from the first payment to his son's nose, asking whether its odor was offensive to him. When Titus said no, he replied, "Yet it comes from urine." As we can see, the initial meaning is, well, yeah, Vespasian was kind of greedy, but it is not about greed per se, and it's not about doesn't matter how you made money, it's still money. It is not a justification of immoral behavior. It is about taxation of urine, the source of ammonia used for bleaching clothes, like togas. So Vespasian, like many Romans, was, as people frequently say, a non-nonsense person. And that's how he told his son Titus to stop making a fuss about essentially nothing. That's the first thing we can learn from this anecdote. The second thing is, the second thing is our guy Suetonius, a contemporary of Vespasian. The problem here is that even though Suetonius fully admits that Vespasian was stingy, he portrays it as, a benign and charming stinginess. Funny anecdotes about a man who likes a good joke. Maybe he wasn't really greedy at all, it was just an act. But when Galba exhibits a similar character trait, the attitude of Suetonius is very different. Because it's Galba. There was nothing charming about him. Or maybe because the family of Suetonius participated in the civil war on the side of Flavia. So theoretically, Galba could be the nicest person you'll ever meet. But he wasn't Vespasian, which means Suetonius will present you a very different picture. Septimius Severus and his sister. There he is, our favorite Black Emperor of Rome. Septimius Severus came to power as a result of a civil war and quickly established a new system which is frequently identified as a military dictatorship. He himself was a Carthaginian, or according to some sources, ethnically he was half Roman, which never prevented him from being culturally Carthaginian first, and Roman, well, second or third, I guess. Hannibal, the enemy of the people of Rome, was a national hero for him. Latin was not his first language, and he spoke it with a noticeable accent for all of his life. You might try and draw some interesting parallels here with modern times, or with 20th century history. These analogies won't be precise, but they will put you in the right frame of mind. This is often overlooked in historiography. But frankly, the whole situation with Septimius Severus raises a lot of questions and sometimes looks simply wild. It's a bit like if in the modern United States a representative of Al-Qaeda becomes a president, or if a Georgian terrorist with a fake biography who speaks Russian with an accent and doesn't speak Georgian at all becomes the head of state in the former Russian Empire. Or if an ethnic Serb becomes the national leader of Albania. Back to Septimius Severus. He spoke with an accent, but at least he was fluent. His sister, on the other hand, knew practically no Latin at all. So, to avoid disgrace and misunderstanding, after all, he was the emperor now, he expelled her from Rome. The situation was beginning to look very strange, so it was about time. Commodus and his wooden sword. Commodus was a huge fan of gladiatorial combat and apparently decided to use them for his PR and propaganda. He wasn't the first emperor to fight in the arena, but he was the first to make something of a career out of it. The mass audience was, as far as we know, absolutely delighted with this decision. The emperor wasn't just a gladiator, he was an unbeatable and invincible champion who could defeat anybody. Historians emphasize that Commodus was a spoiled and cruel man. For example, in the arena, he fought his opponents with a wooden sword. But then outside the arena, he privately, according to unconfirmed rumors, arranged non-public competitions, and there he used combat weapons and actually maimed and killed people. Cassius Dio, for example, tells us about this. This is a very interesting piece of information if we look at it without preconceived notions. For example, it plainly tells us exactly how gladiatorial fights were conducted. And having compared these bits with other data we can find on the subject in the sources, it may eliminate all the doubts about what we are really dealing with. Gladiatorial fights were essentially a prototype of modern professional wrestling, American style. All of the combat was scripted. So it is not surprising at all that Commodus had a wooden sword. Marcus Aurelius, if sources are to be believed, for example, forbade the use of sharpened weapons in the arena at all, so that the actors couldn't accidentally injure each other. Ovid and His Exile. Ovid is one of the most important Roman writers. One can debate the quality of his works, but his Metamorphoses survived and became a hugely important source on the mythology of ancient Greece. Which is an interesting twist, because Ovid, as you all know, was a Roman writer who lived during the time of Augustus. If you think this is somehow odd, then it's because it is quite odd indeed. We don't know to what extent these ancient Greek stories retold by Ovid are authentically Greek, and to what extent they are just a product of his imagination. I've heard a nice joke that Metamorphoses is actually a fan fiction based on ancient Greek mythology. This is partially true. And partially, the whole Greco-Roman mythology was a shared universe where any writer could participate. It's not the mythology of the Abrahamic religions. Nobody's gonna kill you for this. One of the problems with Ovid is that he probably was thinking about sex 24 hours a day, which is like 12 hours more than any other male writer. Apart from the Metamorphoses, where the author reveals that he is extremely interested in how different entities merge into one another and how they penetrate one another. Well, Ovid also wrote an interesting little book called Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, which is in a way an instruction manual for finding yourself a lover. It has various interesting passages and recommendations, like this advice to go to the stadium, sit next to a beautiful girl, and start rubbing your leg against her. So far, it all sounds like another confirmation of this gross misconception about the promiscuity and licentiousness of the Romans, like Roman orgies and so on. But here's an interesting detail. The publication of The Art of Love created a great excuse for Augustus to send Ovid into exile. Apparently, Ovid had screwed up in some other way to incur the anger of the princeps, but a collection of lewd advice just opened the door for the emperor to punch the author in the teeth, because Rome was more or less a society of traditionalists. Augustus officially promoted this ancient Roman virtue and all this advice, like rubbing your feet against somebody, was immediately interpreted as immoral behavior. I have to remind you that Augustus once exiled his own daughter for cheating on her husband. So it is hardly a surprise that Ovid went into exile as well. Chickens and augury. Roman people were quite superstitious. I mean, in general, any large group of people as a whole is quite superstitious. When you are reading the works of ancient Roman historians, it is easy to notice that sometimes they pay too much attention to silly stories about unfavorable omens and stuff like that. But then again, it is nothing compared to medieval texts that simply live in the world of magical realism and religious determinism, where the explanation of absolutely all the phenomena and all human actions is it happened by the will of the god. But when it comes to the superstitions of the upper classes of Roman society, we have some questions. Sometimes we can read in historical materials how exactly these people performed their fortune telling, all kinds of divinations. The established tradition and ancient Roman religion required that prior to any important government sanctioned action, especially if it involved military operations, you should consult the specialists and the gods for favorable or unfavorable omens. There were several variations of such procedures, and behavior of birds or augury was very popular. There is a particularly remarkable story told to us by Suetonius and Cicero, among others, about Publius Claudius Pulcher, who commanded a fleet during the First Punic War. He conducted traditional divinations and tried to get chickens to eat the grain. This was the augury method. If they eat, it is a favorable omen, but they refused. And it seems Claudius just lost his patience. And here is an interesting feature of Roman fortune telling. If something didn't go according to the plan, Romans could find an excuse to repeat the fortune telling procedure again, and then again, and again, until the desired result was achieved, because it was all a traditional ritual for the general public. And the people who actually made the decisions were quite often very indifferent to all this mumbo jumbo. They were not interested in making political or military decisions according to the behavior of birds or some other nonsense. So, to a certain extent, it was just an act. The problem is that our guy Claudius, instead of respecting tradition and continuing the performance, suddenly said that if the chickens didn't want to eat, it was because they must be thirsty. That's why they should be thrown into the sea, where they will surely drink a lot of water while drowning. This way, all the stupid formalities will be observed, a good omen will be obtained, we will stop wasting our time and do something productive instead. Historians, of course, condemn his disgusting, irreverent, and in some ways blasphemous act, but it is fairly obvious from the context how many of the educated Romans really felt about the practice of divination or religious rituals. They just felt that it was important to observe traditions and follow a proper, customary course of actions. And that's why they continued to participate in this farce, constantly tweaking the results when they wanted. It wasn't about the good omens, per se. It was just a ceremony. Marcus Aurelius and his wedding. Romans not only clung to traditions whenever possible, following the established forms, but in reality completely changing their essence. They also had a well-developed jurisprudence. Romans were, first of all, a civilization of legislation. Nobody in the ancient world created such a complex legal machine as Romans, taking into account every tiny minute detail. Actually, nobody created a more perfect system even after the Roman Empire was gone. I mean, Roman law was adopted by the next generations, and the overwhelming majority of the legal systems of the world utilize Roman law up to this day. But obviously, if you have jurisprudence, you also have attempts to turn it, to a certain extent, into a farce as well, just like with these ancestral traditions involving chickens. So here's the anecdote. Emperor Hadrian requested that his successor Antoninus, who later became known as Antoninus Pius, must adopt two young men who were supposed to succeed Antoninus as emperors. Hadrian had a long-term succession plan he wanted to work smoothly after he finally killed himself. Actually, only one of these young guys was supposed to become the new emperor, and the other was just a plan B. Antoninus himself was chosen to be a transitional emperor of sorts. No one expected him to rule for more than 20 years. No one expected him to be one of the best emperors in history. Naturally, of the two heirs, he favored Marcus Annius Severus, now Marcus Aurelius. Marcus was his nephew, what do you expect? To tie Marcus to the family even more, Antoninus decided to marry him to his daughter Faustina, who was Marcus's cousin. And so he did. There's a legal quandary here. A marriage between cousins was illegal, but technically, on paper, Marcus and Faustina were not cousins. They were siblings, brother and sister. Because Antoninus adopted Marcus, and brother and sister cannot marry, that would be incest. So Antoninus legally removed Faustina from his own family. In a way, disowned her, and she ceased to be his daughter. And then he married her to Marcus. She effectively became a member of the family of Marcus, and of Antoninus as well, but as the wife of Marcus Aurelius, not really as a daughter of Antoninus. Like I said, ancient Rome was a civilization of jurisprudence. In fact, there were a lot of interesting stuff going on with these adoption procedures. Senator Claudius Pulcher, not the one from the previous anecdote, but his descendant, famously adopted himself into the plebeian branch of his family, and his adopted father was younger than his adoptive son. And Emperor Trajan adopted Hadrian while being dead. Carneades and Rhetoric. We started with Cato the Elder, let's finish with Cato the Elder as well. Kind of. In the year 155 BC, the Athenians sent 3 ambassadors to Rome so that they could negotiate a deal. Rome imposed a fine of 500 talents on Athens for their actions against the town of Oropus. The goal of the ambassadors was to reverse this decision. Naturally, Athenians decided that it should be people who are extremely well-versed and possess incredible skill of persuasion. Probably they also wanted to impress Romans, who at this point were a rising power in the region, but culturally were essentially a backwater, which produced a grand total of 0 influential thinkers. So the ambassadors were prominent philosophers from 3 respectable schools. Carneades represented the academy, Plato's academy, which at the time evolved into what is called academic skepticism. Cratylus represented Peripatetics, the school initially founded by Aristotle, and Diogenes of Babylon represented Stoicism. All of them held their speeches and obviously greatly impressed the people of Rome, who were, once again, not a match for Greeks when it came to culture. Great thinkers from the worldwide center of philosophical thought came to semi-barbaric copycats who happened to be very good at using sharp weapons. The people of Rome were impressed, but the champion of Roman virtue, Cato the Elder, wasn't. Yes, the speeches were a success, and indeed the fine of 500 talents was reversed, since the philosophers presented their case wonderfully. But Cato expressed his disdain for all things Greek and seemed to be very concerned that the traditional culture of Rome can be diluted and corrupted by the culture of these effeminate Greeks who give elaborate speeches, but when it comes to actions, they look very pale on the battlefield. It was a very interesting idea if you think about it. I mean, Roman culture was, let's put it this way, hugely influenced by Greeks right from the start. Romans were basically heavily Hellenized barbarians. In a way, fighting Greek culture was like fighting yourself. And the hardcore traditionalist Cato, it seems, spoke fluent Greek as any educated person. And there were rumors that he also, as an educated person, was fully capable of quoting long passages from Homer. Cato couldn't stop the process of further Hellenization of society, but at least he successfully advanced the idea that these three ambassadors should be kicked out of Rome immediately. It seems that his demand was met with understanding, not only because of these concerns about Hellenization. It probably was mostly about one guy in particular, Carneades, the skeptic. All three philosophers held their speeches, and the speeches were brilliant. But the best speech was given by Carneades. In fact, he gave two speeches. Both were on justice, obviously. On the first day, he successfully defended the position that the fine imposed on Athens was unjust, and therefore it should have been lifted. He was extremely, shockingly persuasive. But he was a follower of skepticism, which meant that you should explore all the possible positions on the subject, because, simply put, you never know. So the next day, he had another elaborate and very persuasive speech. This time, he was defending the opposite position and totally dismissed all of the arguments he presented the day before. It was quite possibly one of the greatest exercises in rhetoric Rome had ever seen up to this point. And even though everyone agreed that this is indeed a stunning demonstration of skills and a very interesting approach to philosophy, Romans apparently came to the conclusion that Cato actually had a point. How the hell are you planning to deal with a person who probably doesn't really have an opinion and is fully prepared to support and endorse any position imaginable? Yes, skepticism is not about that. And yes, Carneades was a respectable thinker who actually had a system of beliefs. But he chose to demonstrate something else. So even though technically the embassy was a success, the philosophers were asked to pack their bags and leave immediately. I think this is a good ending to the story. It teaches us something, I guess. But I have a better ending. As you all know, this name, or nickname Cato the Elder, implies that there was some other Cato, some junior Cato. The person now known as Cato the Younger was the great-grandson of this senior Cato, Cato the Censor. And Cato the Younger is known for many things, but mostly for the fact that he belonged to the same philosophical school as one of the three ambassadors, Diogenes of Babylon. Cato the Younger was not only the follower of this Hellenistic school, he also became the symbol, the holy martyr, and the battle cry of Roman Stoicism. That's it for today. If you have any interesting anecdotes from ancient Rome you want to share, the anecdotes that make you think, I strongly encourage you to leave them in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, give video 5 stars, upvote, invite a friend, and stuff. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.